The chill of December in New Haven wasn't just the weather, it was a tightening knot in the chest. For 3 years, Elara had navigated the hallowed, ivy-covered halls of Blackwood University, not as its potential savior, but as a phantom. She wore the disguise of the struggling, overachieving scholarship student, the one with perpetually frayed cuffs and the weight of the world resting on her slender shoulders. This was her self-imposed exile, her sociological experiment, a final, necessary purgatory before assuming her birthright. Blackwood was not just an institution. It was the crown jewel of the Ashworth legacy, founded by her great-great-grandfather. And soon, it would be hers. But a few months ago, the experiment had soured. It stopped being an observational study and became a test of endurance. Specifically, a test administered by Dean Arthur Vance. Vance, a man whose ambition was as tailored as his expensive wool suits, saw Elara not as a promising student, but as an inconvenience, a piece of budget paper he could easily shred to pad his own prestige projects. He had no idea he was systematically dismantling the life of the person who could, with a single signature, end his entire career. The annual Christmas Scholarship Gala was looming, the social zenith of the academic calendar. It was a night of forced camaraderie, glittering gowns, and, most importantly for students like Elara, the official announcement of the prestigious $50,000 Founders Winter Scholarship. This scholarship was Elara's lifeline, or so the world believed. She had earned it twice before, maintaining a perfect 4.0 GPA while working 2 draining jobs. The money wasn't vital to the Ashworth heiress, but the validation, the right to remain invisible and authentic, was everything. 2 weeks ago, in a meeting that still echoed in her memory with a metallic coldness, Dean Vance had stripped it all away. "Elara," Vance had said, not looking up from his polished mahogany desk, the city's festive lights blurring outside his panoramic window. "Your dedication is commendable, truly, but Blackwood must evolve. We need impact, visibility." He'd finally looked up, his smile thin and devoid of genuine warmth. The Founders Scholarship, as you know, is about potential. And frankly, your profile doesn't quite generate the buzz we require. The board agreed, tentatively, of course, that it should go to someone who can utilize it as a springboard for immediate, public-facing success. He hadn't stopped there. He'd leaned forward, his voice dropping to a patronizing whisper. "Besides, Elara, you seem resourceful. You'll manage. Someone like you doesn't need to be coddled. This year, the scholarship will go to Mr. Alistair Finch. His father is a prominent senator, you understand? The optics, my dear, are simply better." The casual dismissal had been a physical blow. Vance hadn't just taken her scholarship. He had publicly downgraded her entire existence. He had defined her worth, not by her relentless effort, but by the absence of an influential last name. And the worst part? Elara, the heiress, the majority owner of Blackwood's future, could only nod, swallow the humiliation, and say, "I understand, Dean Vance. Thank you for your time." That night, everything changed. The experiment was over. The game was now pure, unadulterated revenge. In the tiny, cramped library cubicle that had become her sanctuary, Elara began to work. No more studying, only planning. She was meticulous, relentless. She didn't plot to expose Vance's minor financial indiscretions. That would be fleeting, small. She wanted a public, profound dismantling. She wanted the shockwave of the reveal to obliterate his entire carefully constructed facade, exactly at the peak of the university's year, the Christmas Gala. The gala was set for Christmas Eve. The ultimate power play demanded the ultimate stage. Elara had access to Blackwood's internal financial audits, the deep, unvarnished truth about the university's assets, trusts, and, crucially, the opaque structure of its board and funding. Her family office, operating under a veil of complete secrecy, had been quietly monitoring the university's performance for the past decade. Vance, in his smug arrogance, had made a series of critical, career-ending errors. First, he had been aggressively selling off parcels of protected land, sacred historical grounds donated by Elara's great-grandfather, to fund a vanity project, the Vance Innovation Center. The contracts were deliberately vague, relying on the obscurity of the Ashworth Family Trust's original charter. Vance believed the charter was too old and complex for anyone, especially a resourceful student, to decipher. Second, he had funneled a substantial portion of the General Scholarship Fund, not just Elara's, but dozens of others, into a speculative, high-risk investment scheme designed to briefly inflate the university's endowment figures right before the annual board review. He stood to gain a massive performance bonus if the numbers looked good in January. This was fraud, pure and simple, but buried under layers of corporate accounting language. Elara printed out the financial statements, hundreds of pages, reducing them into a single devastating presentation. She organized the evidence not chronologically, but narratively: the land betrayal, the scholarship theft, and finally, the imminent collapse. The final slide was the punchline: a legal notice drafted by the Ashworth legal team, freezing all of Vance's assets and initiating an immediate, irrevocable vote of no confidence. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, muffling the sounds of the campus. It was beautiful, tranquil, a stark contrast to the emotional storm raging within Elara. She looked at her reflection in the dark window, the tired eyes, the faint dark circles, the mask of the struggling student. It was almost time to take the mask off. She received a mass email from Dean Vance that evening, a condescendingly cheerful invitation to the gala. It was signed off with the phrase, "Let us celebrate the spirit of giving and the bright future of Blackwood." Elara deleted the email, but kept the irony. She was, in fact, about to give Vance a future he never deserved, and it wouldn't be bright. It would be blindingly, publicly painful. The date was set, Christmas Eve, the night of the performance. The night the dean's life would become collateral damage for his casual cruelty. The humiliation he dealt her would be returned tenfold. She packed the evidence, the physical proof of his downfall, into an elegant, discreet portfolio case. She had suffered through the cold of his disdain. Now, she would unleash the blizzard of his ruin. The preparation was complete. All that remained was the final, devastating act. The Blackwood University Grand Ballroom was a spectacle of deliberate opulence, a gilded cage designed to impress donors and intimidate students. On Christmas Eve, it glittered under the weight of imported lights and towering, perfectly dressed fir trees. The air, thick with the scent of pine and privilege, hummed with the strained merriment of the academic elite. Dean Arthur Vance, looking resplendent and utterly smug in a bespoke tuxedo, worked the room with the practiced grace of a politician, his hand perpetually extended, his smile wide and utterly artificial. He was the undisputed master of this domain, the temporary emperor of Blackwood, unaware that the foundation beneath his polished shoes was about to crack. Elara arrived late, deliberately. She wore the same simple, inexpensive black dress she had worn to the gala every year, a silent uniform of her assumed poverty. She bypassed the heavy bronze doors, choosing a service entrance near the kitchen, keeping to the shadows. She wanted her entrance into the main hall to be unavoidable, but her presence in the preceding hour to be negligible. Vance's downfall required focus on the event, not the anticipation. Alistair Finch, the senator's son, the undeserving recipient of Elara's hard-won scholarship, was already basking in the spotlight. Vance had him on his arm, parading him around like a prized pony, introducing him to every high-profile guest. "Alistair is the future of Blackwood, gentlemen," Vance boomed, his voice carrying just enough to reach Elara as she settled near a quiet corner by the non-alcoholic punch. a true student of impact, the kind of young man who understands the value of public service, not just private study. The implication hung heavy in the air. Elara, the ghost in the corner, was neither impactful nor worthy. She felt the eyes of a few of her peers, the genuine scholarship students who had also been overlooked, flicker toward her with pity. That pity was the final insult. It was the moment she knew this revenge had to be total. It wasn't just for her. It was for every quiet, dedicated student Vance had steamrolled for a better photo opportunity. The evening progressed with agonizing slowness, a deliberate tightening of the screw. Vance gave his first toast, a self-congratulatory ode to the university's growth, failing to mention the land sales or the investment risks. He toasted Alistair Finch's brilliant trajectory, while pointedly ignoring Elara, even when she was standing directly in his sightline during the cocktail hour. Then came the centerpiece of the humiliation, the presentation of the scholarship. The lights dimmed, focusing solely on the raised stage where Dean Vance stood beside a massive gold-embossed check bearing Alistair Finch's name. Vance took the microphone, his voice dripping with condescending holiday cheer. Before we celebrate Mr. Finch, I want to take a moment to acknowledge a student who embodies the quiet, persistent effort that underpins Blackwood's reputation, Elara Ashworth. Elara felt the familiar cold wave of exposure. She knew what was coming. It was the public pat on the head, the consolation prize of recognition meant to silence any critics who might notice her absence from the main event. Elara has done fine work here, Vance continued, his tone suggesting surprise that she hadn't given up yet. She worked diligently, despite her obvious, limited resources. She's the epitome of the resourceful student who learns to make do. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, soliciting the silent approval of the wealthy donors. We wish her well as she continues her journey, relying on her own grit. But tonight, he pivoted sharply back to Alistair. Tonight, we celebrate the aspiration, the future of funding and prestige. Alistair, please accept this scholarship and use it to reach the dizzying heights we know your family name guarantees. The applause was loud, polite, and crushing. Alistair accepted the check with an entitled smirk, shaking Vance's hand for the cameras. Elara stood utterly still, an island of ice in a sea of forced warmth. Her hands were clasped tightly around the discreet portfolio case she carried, the only item of value she wore tonight. Inside lay the financial records, the legal documents, and the unassailable proof of Vance's betrayal. The humiliation was complete. It was public. It was recorded, and it was timed perfectly to the peak of the Christmas celebration. Vance had marked his calendar with her defeat. Now, it was time for Elara to mark his calendar with his downfall. She took a slow, deep breath, pulling strength from the sheer audacity of her next move. She wasn't just walking up to the stage, she was walking onto the set of a controlled explosion. The entire Ashworth legal team, operating remotely from New York, was already poised, their fingers hovering over the necessary buttons. The press release detailing the financial fraud, the emergency communication to the Board of Trustees, and the immediate freezing of the Vance assets. Her single action would be the trigger. She began to move, threading her way through the celebrating crowd. She noticed the small, nearly imperceptible glint of the security cameras, ensuring every moment of the dean's triumph and her subsequent total vengeance would be captured in high definition. This wouldn't be a rumor, it would be a broadcast. As she approached the stage, a young assistant, recognizing her as the resourceful student, politely tried to redirect her. "Miss Ashworth, the photo session is concluded. Perhaps you should rejoin the reception." Elara looked the assistant directly in the eye, her expression now utterly devoid of the weary submission she had worn for 3 years. Her voice, low and precise, carried a new, unfamiliar resonance. "Tell Dean Vance that the Ashworth Family Trust has just concluded its 3-year evaluation of Blackwood University's financial stewardship. and I have the findings." The assistant froze, bewildered by the mention of the legendary invisible trust. The name Ashworth hung in the air, a silent alarm bell. Vance, still basking in the glow of the stage lights, finally noticed her. He watched, a flicker of irritation hardening his features, as Elara ascended the 2 small steps onto the stage. She stood beside him, her simple black dress a stark contrast to his shimmering tuxedo. "Elara, what are you doing?" Vance hissed, grabbing her elbow with a possessive, restraining grip. "This is highly inappropriate. Get off the stage." Elara gently but firmly extracted her arm. She didn't look at the check or at Alistair. She looked straight into the lens of the nearest camera, her expression turning from quiet exhaustion to lethal clarity. "Dean Vance," she said, her voice amplified by the stage microphone, cutting through the murmuring crowd like a shard of glass. "I believe you missed a critical announcement tonight. Before we celebrate the future, we must address the betrayal of the past. And since this is Christmas Eve, I wanted to present a gift, the gift of truth." She placed the slim portfolio case onto the podium. Vance's face, moments before flushed with pride, began to drain of color. He reached for the case, panic beginning to rise in his eyes. He knew, instinctively, that his casual cruelty had come home to roost. The trap was set. The detonator had been armed. Dean Arthur Vance's composure, the carefully cultivated mask of academic authority, began to crumble instantly. His hand, shaking slightly, hovered over the portfolio case Elara had placed on the podium. He tried a final desperate maneuver, leaning into the microphone with a strained, placating chuckle. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems our charming scholarship winner has a little holiday enthusiasm. Elara, please, let's discuss this privately. This is not the appropriate venue for campus grievances." Elara didn't flinch. Her voice, calm and steady, was already cutting through his weak defense. She was no longer the desperate student. She was the executor of judgment. "On the contrary, Dean Vance, this is precisely the right venue, because this document concerns the $50,000 Founders Winter Scholarship you awarded tonight, and the true source of Blackwood's funding. Specifically, the source you believed was too ignorant to monitor your actions." She opened the portfolio. Instead of shouting accusations, she used the cold, undeniable authority of financial language. She pulled out a single laminated document, a recent internal audit summary. 3 years ago, I began attending Blackwood under a pseudonym, living undercover to assess the integrity of the institution my family founded, the one whose trust funds are held under the name Ashworth, she stated, letting the legendary, powerful name land with the force of a hammer blow. The ballroom, previously a din of chatter, fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Faces contorted in disbelief, moving from curiosity to horror. Alistair Finch, still holding the oversized check, looked like a statue carved from cheap ice. Vance lunged for the microphone, his polished veneer dissolving into sheer panic. "Security! Remove this woman! This is a fabrication!" Before security could even take a step, Elara held up the summary page, aiming it directly at the camera. "Let's begin with the scholarship fund itself. The one Dean Vance told me I didn't have the right profile for. This audit shows that over the last fiscal quarter, $3.2 million, money designated specifically for student aid, was quietly siphoned off and redirected, not into the endowment, but into a private, high-risk venture capital scheme, personally managed by Dean Vance's brother-in-law. This was done to artificially inflate the quarterly gains needed to trigger a 6-figure performance bonus for the dean in January." She paused, letting the scope of the theft sink in. The murmurs returning now were not of polite gossip, but of furious, appalled realization. Donors were already reaching for their phones. "This scholarship," Elara gestured toward Alistair, "is merely window dressing, paid for with the remaining scraps of a fund you intended to loot. The shame is not just taking my scholarship. The shame is sacrificing the future of dozens of truly needy students for a personal bonus." Vance was sputtering, his face mottled with rage and fear. "Lies. Slander. You have no authority here." "Ah, but I do," Elara corrected, her eyes holding his in a gaze of surgical precision. "This brings us to the second document." She produced a thick, embossed folder. "Dean Vance, you have been aggressively selling off historical campus land protected by the Ashworth Trust Charter since 1905, to build your vanity project, the Vance Innovation Center. You believed the original trust documents were too obscure and old for scrutiny." She opened the folder to reveal a recent, officially stamped deed. "What you failed to check, Dean Vance, is the amendment added in 1998, which gives the current majority beneficiary of the Ashworth Trust, my mother, and soon me, immediate irrevocable power to dissolve the Board of Trustees and assume temporary administrative control if a breach of fiduciary duty or historical trust is confirmed." She laid the deed down and picked up the final devastating document, a legal decree with the seal of the Supreme Court of Delaware. At 11:59 p.m. tonight, Christmas Eve, the Ashworth Family Trust legal team filed this injunction and emergency notice. Effective immediately. Her voice rose, commanding the entire room. Dean Arthur Vance is stripped of all authority at Blackwood University. His employment is terminated, pending a full criminal investigation into the misappropriation of scholarship funds and the illegal sale of protected assets. The camera zoomed in on Vance's face. The man who had mocked her poverty minutes before was now visibly staggering, his knees buckling under the weight of the reveal. He was publicly, irreversibly ruined. "Dean Vance took my Christmas scholarship," Elara finished, looking directly at the camera, tears of suppressed frustration finally welling up, but not falling. "He didn't know I funded the university, and now I'm reclaiming it. Consider this the beginning of a long overdue, complete institutional audit." She turned to Alistair Finch, who was holding the useless check like a toxic brand. "Mr. Finch, the founder's scholarship is voided, as the funds were fraudulently secured. I suggest you return it immediately." As the clock struck midnight, marking Christmas Day, the grand ballroom was no longer a stage for a holiday celebration, but a crime scene and a tribunal. Security, realizing the true power dynamics, abandoned Vance and instead moved to protect Elara. Vance stood alone, pale and humiliated, surrounded by the silence of his evaporated influence. The cameras flashed, capturing the definitive image, the former dean, disgraced, against the backdrop of the soaring Christmas trees. The inversion of power was complete. The poor, overlooked student had become the supreme authority. The taste of victory on this frigid, vengeful Christmas morning was sweeter than any holiday wine. Elara, the heiress disquieted, finally walked out, leaving the wreckage of her tormentor's life behind her.